In documentary filmmaking, it is inherent that we talk or tell stories about other people. So my question is, what could be problematic about that?
Well, where do I start with that? Thank you for repeating the question. And thanks for inviting me to this conversation. I'm Anishinaabe, which is First Nations Canadian. And so, Indigenous relationship to documentary film has gone back to the earliest days of film, of course, and has been problematic probably since day one. I think there's this global psyche of who Indigenous people are, particularly Indigenous North American people. And so much of that has really been informed by the Hollywood Indian, but also, of course, ethnographic documentaries and documentaries that have for decades othered us. We're talking about the Kill the Documentary, Nanook of the North was a really strong focus of that article, of course. And that's a great example in terms of sort of what the lens has been historically onto Indigenous people. But, the problem lies in rendering us invisible in terms of silencing our voices, oppressing our voices, certainly marginalizing them over time. With Indigenous national cinemas, when Indigenous nations start telling their own stories on screen, very often it starts with short social justice documentary, and for very clear reasons. And that's really exciting. Every single Indigenous national documentary, Indigenous national screen culture that has emerged has really begun with this kind of work. And it's an urgent kind of work. It's really, it's putting forth a perspective, as I said, that's sort of long been overlooked. And I think there's a real, also, key difference in terms of Indigenous people telling stories from within our own communities or from within our own nations. One of the hallmarks, I would say, of Indigenous filmmaking is that Indigenous filmmakers, when making a documentary, have an innate responsibility to that community or nation that doesn't exist in the same way for those who aren't from that community or nation. And so when that inherent responsibility doesn't exist, problems can certainly arise.
Thank you for your answer, Jason. I hope you hear me better now.
Yes, thank you.
In a talk by Lisa Valencia Swenson, at Hot Dog, she said that the question, who is telling whose story to whom and why, should be at the center of every documentary film project. Toni, why do you think that question is important to ask and answer for yourself when you make a documentary film?
Well, for me, it starts with really basic self-reflection. My background is in anthropology. I have a bachelor's in anthropology as well as a master's in visual anthropology. And what happens is, particularly from the anthropological perspective, because filmmaking has such a long history in that realm, there has actually been opportunities and times for corrections, so part of the ethnographic work is like looking at oneself as an observer, which is like very important, and how your presence in a particular space can change the dynamic. And frankly, from my past work reviewing proposals for fiscal sponsorship program that I oversaw a while back, there really is a strong sense of self-reflection, and strong sense of a lack of a self-reflection. I would receive proposals where focused on Indigenous communities from non-Indigenous filmmakers, and there was almost this weird Columbusing that would happen. So the fact that that particular person who wrote that proposal had not heard about that particular issue in that community meant to them that no one ever had heard about it and no film had ever been made about it. And that is simply not the case. So it's like this really weird invisibilizing of these visible people. But also in the case of narratives like in the African American or in the Latinx space here in the U.S. with white filmmakers, a lot of white filmmakers who would go into these communities to get their story, to extract their story. And in many cases, their audience were other members of their community, so white people, who were really looking at it from a purely voyeuristic lens. And in a way, it commodifies the people that are being seen. So one question that I would ask when I was reviewing applications was, I would ask questions in regards to protagonist stewardship. And what I mean by that is like when I read the application, do the people who are being shown in the film, does it appear that they are being valued and cared for and loved? But then also, who has the power? So if a filmmaking team is all white and they're going to a community of folks of color, they should ask those questions like, why are they there? They should ask questions about who their audience is. One thing a lot of people would say was, they would try to raise awareness. When my response to that was, awareness for who? Because the people you are filming are completely aware of their situation. Mm-hmm. So what are you doing beyond awareness? Mm-hmm. What are you doing beyond showing poverty porn? What are you doing beyond trauma porn? And these, what's really important that when you're going into these communities that aren't yours, one thing that you have to really ask yourself is how do the communities that you're filming have agency? And every community that you're filming in has a sense of agency and a sense of self about the things that are happening to them. Yeah. So what side of that are you showing? But also, I would ask questions like, why are you going into these communities' colors to tell these stories when they're like stories in your own communities, mm-hmm. That you can address? Like, why don't you turn the lens on yourself and try to enlighten yourself about your own space in the world versus, going into these communities to kind of like garner awards. And also there's an issue of funding, because sometimes a lot of funders tend to continue to fund these types of narratives and work. And then, the outrage doesn't come until the film is out into the world. And then a statement is made, but there seems to be a lack of correcting that behavior. So I really think it's incumbent upon the gatekeepers early on who are like looking at these applications and these projects from the beginning to be more critical, and then they have a strong responsibility to be more critical about the projects they choose to fund and support and elevate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your answer. Before we go into the funding question, Tamara, a lot of filmmakers that apply or pitch projects here say they want to make films on eye level with their protagonists. What does making a film on eye level with protagonists from a different community mean to you, and is that even possible?
I've never even heard that term before, so it's really interesting to me to think about. And I think, sort of to pick up on what Toni was talking about, I think these filmmakers have to, if they're saying they're going to make it on the eye level, they have to define what does that really mean and who is this benefiting, and why are they telling this story? Because I can tell you as a producer, spending the last 5 years living in Ethiopia, I was getting emails constantly, primarily from European white documentary directors and producers who were looking to come into the country to do a film on A, B, and C because it was something they picked up on in a news article, or they went on a vacation, or someone told them about it, and they have no understanding about the story, no local context, they don't speak the languages, and these are the films that are unfortunately still being made. And I think, yes, in some cases, the financiers, I would say predominantly the North American documentary financiers, are starting to ask questions about authorship, about access, about, why are you the person to tell this story? But I think on the flip side, the broadcasters are not looking at that closely enough. So these films are still being financed through television. They're still being bought by television. These films are also still being programmed by festivals. So, you know, I had I guess like a Twitter spat with Hot Docs a few days ago, because on the one hand, as you mentioned in the opening of this, they're doing a lot of good things in their industry program. Having Lisa there, even though it's a temporary mat leave fill, is really, really important to make Hot Docs focus on issues of authorship, but they're not doing that on the programming side. So we're still seeing these poverty porn, extractive films that are also, you know, I think if you're the filmmaker who says, I'm doing this thing on the eye level, think about whose space you're taking up, and think about, guess what, if I'm sitting in Berlin or Paris or LA and I have access to some funding, perhaps I should sit back and be the producer and help to facilitate the filmmaker in the global south to be the creative voice and give them a platform to tell the story through the actual local perspective. So I don't know that I fully answered your questions, but that is how I would certainly react to seeing that sort of language on an application. I think that there are also catchwords and terms that people think, oh, if I say this or I say that, then it's, you know, okay. If it's, you know, I'm going to go into an Indigenous community and I've looked at the protocols document, so I've used some of their language in my application. That's not how it's intended to be used. You have to genuinely understand what you're trying to do and understand why you're doing it. So I think oftentimes the onus is also on funders, programmers, decision makers to actually go back and ask questions and make sure the person really believes and comprehends what they're saying they're going to do and how they're going to do it.
Thank you. How you went to a German film school and you work in the German documentary film industry. How do you think what we just talked about is implemented in film schools in Germany in general? And what do you think are the biggest hurdles BIPoC filmmakers have to go through here in school?
I wasn't sure if you were addressing me, Sigrid.
Yeah, I'm addressing you. How?
It's for me, right?
No, I'm addressing you. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you all for these inspirational inputs, because I feel like in Germany, and especially coming from one of the film schools in Germany, we are still learning and understanding what these structural systems do with us, and as well as BIPoC filmmakers, and me as an Asian German, being born and raised in Germany, socialized in Germany, I understand that Germany in some terms is very slow in picking up these kind of discussions as well. There's, I think in our society, we're still struggling so much with actually acknowledging that there's racism in society. And of course it leads to all layers of society when we're talking about education, talking about this big body of financing which the German television channels do have access to, and how most of the films that students from film school, when they leave film school, you need funding from television when you want to make a film in Germany, and most of the times, and if you look at the structures and the bodies, still see that all of the people in decision-making positions are most primarily are white people who are very little aware of question of anti-racism, of representation. So when you ask me at this point in German film schools, for example, there's still a big lack of awareness, and also speaking structurally. Not many BIPoC filmmakers do apply for film schools, but also that is sectionally speaking, another question of class. Who actually does make films in Germany? Who gets to tell stories in Germany? And then this is a much broader question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think a big question here is a lot of times who's allowed to tell which story, which I think is not what we want to answer tonight, but to jump on that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you guys not hear me again? Oh, Leute.
Do you hear me, Tamara, Toni, and Jason?
Yeah,
yes.
I hear you too.
Hear you. I guess, well, I'd like to kind of comment on some of the things that have been said. and provide some specific examples. So last year, with everything that was happening in the U.S., around the murder of George Floyd and the protests that happened here in the U.S., as well as the solidarity worldwide. One thing that I was having to deal with and which cost me a lot of emotional labor were white filmmakers who were in the program that I was overseeing, all of a sudden discovering that racism exists. And then wanting to have conversations for me, because I would do office hours a couple of days a week, where people just call in, and just talk to me. But all of a sudden, Black Lives Mattered to them. They were wanting to connect their film to Black Lives Matter, because it was, for them, it was clearly a moment and a moment for them to capitalize upon, which frankly was utterly infuriating and disgusting. And they would, sometimes people would ask me, well, how can I take advantage of this moment? And then my response to them was, well, it's interesting that it's a moment for you, because like Black and brown people get killed every day by the cops. That's the reality that we live under. And they would talk about the video of George Floyd's murder, sometimes like giving graphic descriptions. And like I'm at a point where it's been years since I watched any of those videos, because it's so utterly traumatizing. So I'm having to be a quote unquote professional and having a dialogue with these people who really, in my mind, in some way, are lacking like basic level of humanity in regards to their understanding of the pain and the trauma of this situation. And I do think the thing that was different about the murder of George Floyd was the fact that we were all home, watching because of the pandemic, so our attention was a focus. So that maybe that was the one difference. But it was really this difference between like this, like I said, like commodifying of this moment. And I had somebody talking about, I'm going to give kind of flippant here, but the film could have been about cheese making in Antarctica, and they would say, Black Lives Matter. And I would have to kind of break it down for them, like why, for this particular instance, are you trying to make this correlation? And I would have to repeatedly say, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. Like for what you're trying to do with your film, this doesn't make sense. And some got it, but very few did. And that was really something that was hard to deal with.
I think that's also...
and navigate, and particularly navigate in an industry that still really elevates white filmmakers and their methods of storytelling, and not getting support from my organization as well. Just the complete lack of understanding around that.
I'm not sure if you can hear me again now, guys. Do you hear me? Nobody hears me. Okay.
Sagan isn't there. I'll chime in with some reflections and comments of what's been said as well too. It's so great to hear all of you speak. Toni, Tamara, it's absolutely everything that you said, of course, is really relevant to the Indigenous side as well. The document that Tamara was referring to, the protocols document, is a document called On-Screen Protocols and Pathways, which I developed at Imaginative, that was launched a couple of years ago. It's a production framework for responsible filmmaking when Indigenous content is being used, or Indigenous stories are used in the actual film itself. It's based on similar documents in Australia. Certainly cultural protocols and responsibilities have been in our nations for hundreds of years, if not longer. So it was really an active response to really say, on the one hand, enough is enough. We have to stop non-Indigenous filmmakers from telling harmful stories that perpetuate stereotypes, that have very real day-to-day impact on the lives of Indigenous people. This is true not just in Canada, but worldwide. And right from the start, I mean, we were always cautious and aware that we didn't want this to be a roadmap, a checklist for non-Indigenous filmmakers to tell these stories. So it was much, one hopes to raise awareness that our stories are really fundamental to our cultures, to our lives, and they don't belong to one person. These are often collectively owned or owned by specific families or individuals. And again, it was about responsibility in terms of telling that story to the larger community or nation that is really essential. So to use, adjectives like extractive and verbs like extracting, I mean, that is really the case. I mean, these are essential cultural resources. And oftentimes they are mined like any other resources and misused and taken out of the hands of Indigenous people. So, the protocol framework was always meant to be a living and ongoing framework. And I mean, Tamara, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the uptake really needs to happen on the programming and decision maker side, not just in Canada, but internationally. I think that framework has a pretty significant impact on the major funders in Canada at the very least. But, these are institutions that have, very low numbers, often one, or usually no Indigenous employees working in these institutions, and certainly often not in roles of decision making. We have the choice. We will greenlight different kinds of stories than non-Indigenous people will tell. Just a few weeks ago, the Indigenous Screen Office, which is a relatively new organization in Canada, just received its first allocation from the federal government, which really has been, the result of decades of advocacy of Indigenous filmmakers really carving paths with all their strength in a hostile industry, and really coming to this point where now there is substantial funding for a national organization run by Indigenous people to greenlight projects by Indigenous people. The other part of it really comes to mind is that in Canada, the last 5 years have been quite transformative in terms of awareness of Indigenous rights in the history. We have a long way to go, absolutely. But what's really happening as well, too, is as awareness has risen and as access for Indigenous filmmakers to access Indigenous specific funding for creation work, what we're seeing is individuals really making claim to Indigenous identity based on long ago ancestral connections. We're talking like hundreds of years ago, and using this as rationale to claim indigeneity and access this funding that frankly isn't theirs to access. We have seen so many films being created by these individuals, and it's always along the same things. It's a discovery of a long ago Indigenous ancestor and their journey to discovering these things. And this is really one of the most problematic things I think currently that's happening. And again, oftentimes you find non-Indigenous festivals and programmers playing these kinds of work because it's an easy access point. And it feeds into this larger narrative native that is so appealing to the Western psyche.
I'm not sure if you can hear me, guys. Okay, great. Thank you for your points, Jason. I think one great example you made once. Can you turn off the sound on the TV, please? Okay, one great example you made once was imagine if, wait, I think we have to turn off the sound here quickly. Okay. One time you made an example saying, imagine if, I'm using Germany as an example here, imagine if German film or TV was entirely made by British people, and all of the films that we have done, that we see about Germany were made by British people, and we only see their films. Wouldn't German people also want films made by Germans to show their kind of view, their worldview, and see themselves in their own eyes? I think that is a really great example to show how BIPoC community especially feel about films made about them by other communities and not taking in their views and their kind of expertise. Tamara, you're part of the Racial Equity Media Collective. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do there and why you think data collection especially is important for in documentary filmmaking and funding?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. As long as the echo gone. Okay, the REMC, or the Racial Equity Media Collective, is a nonprofit organization in Canada founded 2 years ago by working filmmakers. I'm one of the founding board members, and really it was because we were raising a lot of issues, and we realized that we needed an institution to do this work, to lobby collectively for the industry. Our organization came out of a lot of community consultation to make sure we weren't taking up space from the other racialized and Indigenous-led festivals, training institutions. We work actually quite closely with the Indigenous Screen Office, which Jason mentioned earlier. They gave us a lot of mentorship and support when we started out. And our focus is quite narrow in terms of, as I mentioned, not duplicating, but it's around research, policy change, and community consultation. Because one of the things we noticed, especially increasingly in the last 6 months, is institutions decide to take decisions really quickly because it's the moment where they feel pressure to address some of these issues for equity and sovereignty seeking groups, but they don't consult the community. So there have been moments when we've stepped in and said, how did you come to this decision? Can we help you to be the bridge between those communities? Because that's why we're here. And we've also been doing a lot of pushing in Canada, specifically right now, because our Broadcasting Act, which governs a lot of our federal funding and how the TV stations operate with independent creators, is under review. So really for the REMC, our core messages and asks right now is, one is for race-based data collection, which I'll come back to because I know, Sagan, you wanted me to talk about that. 2, it's for high-level equity staff oversight. So also sort of what Jason picked up on, if you're going to have racialized or Indigenous staff, they can't be in a tokenized role. They have to have actual power, budget, decision-making access. And then lastly is, if there are going to be targets or incentives, if you're a funder, if you're a broadcaster, those need to be developed in consultation with community. You can't just pull that number sort of out of the air, and they have to be monitored, and there needs to be evaluation reporting, which is why you need the high-level equity oversight. But I mean, really the first thing we're pushing for is the race-based data collection. This is something we're pushing for across the industry entirely, and sort of our first big project is sort of the state of affairs in Canada in relation to that, and what are the best policies and practices so that this information can actually be collected in a way that is not allowing people, hopefully, to self-report that they're from a community that they actually, in fact, have no connection to, is not requiring a producer like me to make assumptions and report about the rest of the crew or the above the line crew on my film, because that often happens right now. People should be able to report for themselves in the way that they see themselves, and not in the way that I may assume they are in terms of their gender, sexuality, or race as a producer who's filling out those forms. And this is also data that we feel needs to be shared with the community, because the community needs to be able to review this stuff and to hold some of these institutions to account. And I think the main reason we're really pushing for this is because if we don't know where we're at right now, if we don't know as a funding institution how much money went at the door to community ABC, some broadcasters will say, yes, we've done projects with Black or Indigenous or Southeast Asian or what have you people. But when you actually dig into it, you realize those may have been the writers and directors, but the actual ownership of that content still sat within the white community. So there's a lot of levels to investigate with this data collection. And it also relates to festivals. As we talked about earlier, who are the people making these films? Who are the people who own them? It's not always so simple as just seeing a racialized person in the director's chair. We have to dig further into that. We have to look at who we're funding, who we're programming, and who we're putting into markets, and who we have on panels. This sometimes I'm invited to panels where it's the racialized panel, and then if you look at the other panels, it's still just white people. So I think it is about collecting the numbers and doing an audit and having a really hard discussion, and that's what the REMC is really focused on.
Thank you for addressing that, Tamara.
I think it's really important that also international we do that, but in Germany especially, we are really at the beginning of data collection. How you're part of the Vielfalt in Film organization, which translates to diversity in film. And you recently done a study about how diverse the German film industry is or not is. Can you tell us a little bit more about that study and your key takeaways from it?
Yes, first of all, I was very interested to hear Tamara telling a bit more about the RMC, because I believe that we can learn a lot from you guys over there, just from the experience and how, because in Germany and also with the diversity in film, a survey which we did, it was an online survey, which was cooperate with Crew United. It's a platform. It's a data network platform for filmmakers in Germany. And it was a survey that was taken by around 6,000 people within German film industry, and they were intersectional speaking, being asked about their experience of discrimination behind and in front of the camera. And it turns out that there's, of course, there's this huge amount of discrimination in terms of sexual discrimination, pay gap, questions of pay gap, racism in front of the camera. And so the study, it's called Vielfalt in Film. It just underlined what so many BIPoC filmmakers in Germany and actors are experiencing subjectively, and eventually now we have a set of data and numbers to actually to make demands based on these data. And again, as Tamara said, race-based data collection is so crucial in this respect, in terms of advocacy and policy making. And you can have a look at these data and the results on Vielfalt in Film. I will post it in the chat later. But I think it is just super important to underline the fact that we need data to actually make policy and change things and in the structures. Yeah.
Can I just jump in with another added comment here? So I mean, please. Absolutely agree with these things. And one of the things that we grapple with in Canada in regards to race-based data collection is the Privacy Act. So a lot of the state funders won't or say can't access this information because of Privacy Act restrictions. And so they do kind of voluntary data collection forms and whatnot. One of the things I often counter with is that, you know, as Indigenous filmmakers, or members of the community, we're willing to identify ourselves as such. We're willing to put that information forward because we know what's at stake, and we know how much more will be at stake as more funding becomes available. So, I mean, that's often a counter to, I think, sort of a hesitancy to sometimes collect that information. So, I mean, very fundamentally too, sometimes I think legislation has to be changed.
I'd like to also speak to the data piece, because it's so important to collect data. And just like on a small scale, for the podcast that I have, What's Up with Docs, myself and my producer, from day one, we collected racialized data, religious data, disability data, sexuality, orientation, and gender data. And the great thing about that, like after our first season, was we could actually sit down and really see where our gaps were. Like it was just perfectly clear. So when we were planning for our second season, we knew where we wanted to target invites. So we had a lot of Latinx guests. We were very well represented there, you know, but we realized, we wanted to have more Asian and Asian American guests. So we put out asks for that. So that's the target for the season. But one thing I also wanted to point out about the data, because in the US, in the documentary space in the US, there are a lot of organizations that do a lot of surveys and data collection, and then they present it, and then they get a lot of praise for that, for presenting it. But then the next step is lacking. And that next step is actually taking an action for change based on that data. And when I found that we'd have tried to have those particular conversations. Okay, so now that we know that, you know, that even though an organization has or a particular festival always screens films from BIPoC filmmakers. But when you look at the ownership of that, the creative ownership of that work, then it's not BIPoC filmmakers. Like, what are you doing to alleviate that? Like, what are the questions that you are asking as you're doing your programming to make sure that doesn't happen? And for me, in the US, that step is something that's really lacking. It seems like there's a celebration of having the conversation, but there's not a push to specific action. And to me, like when someone tells me thank you for having a conversation, it actually kind of like raises my cackles a bit, because like when I hear that, it really feels like a dismissal, because I'm like, hey, what's the next step? Even if it's a tiny action, you know, as long as we're moving forward, like that's what I want. That's what I feel, and that's what I feel like is lacking.
We talked about, I think it's for us important to know what's lacking, but also a lot of people, I don't think they understand. They're in the beginning of, they want to make a film, right? And then they want to make a film about a community that's not their own. So what would can you tell us, maybe Tamara, and how your best practices of how you would approach if someone would come to you and say, I want to make a film, maybe my own community, but also maybe a white person wanting to make a film about another community. What would be prerequisites, for example, Tamara, that you would take this film as a producer, or the best case studies that you said, I produced this film and I think that is a great example of filmmaking. Do you understand my question, Tamara?
Yeah, I think I heard most of your question, and I think I kind of alluded to this before. I refuse probably 99.9% of pitches I get from white producers who want to come and make something with me in Ethiopia, because generally I just don't understand why they need to be doing that, and I feel that they should make space for someone else. I do have one project right now which is in production with both a Chinese American and a white British filmmaker. The exception with that project, or why that project is happening, is because I'm not just the bureaucrat producer pushing papers. I have a strong creative voice in the storytelling in the film in terms of the Ethiopian perspective, and the film is also largely focused on the Chinese community in Ethiopia. So thus it makes sense for a member of the Chinese diaspora to be involved in that film. The British director speaks Mandarin, lived for a very long time in China. So there is, in regards to this, to me, the proper connections to the community and the logic about why are they the people telling the story, and also the realization of how and why they need to collaborate with me on the Ethiopian elements and the Ethiopian eye in the film. But I think that is the exception versus the rule. Very rarely has someone ever approached me with, I think, the willingness to collaborate in that way. So generally my answer is no, I don't think you should be making this film right now. I think you should be empowering someone from the community to tell this story. And I think this is also something we deal with even within Ethiopia. A lot of the training programs I do specifically with documentary filmmakers, because we're a country of over 80 different ethnic groups and many, many different languages. And there's also sometimes problems within the country of someone from one ethnic group wanting to go and tell a story about another community, where there's also issues of understanding, access, and also being the right person with the right point of view to tell that story.
I'd like to add to that too, as far as like examples on how to do it right. Sam Feder's film Disclosure is about the depiction of trans folks primarily in Hollywood. And what they did for that particular film was they adopted a fellowship model. So so all the crew on that film were trans. However, if they could not find someone who was trans for a particular, who was experienced enough for a particular space, they would bring on a non-trans person. However, what would happen is they would bring someone up to kind of like apprentice under that person. So they were learning those skills. So, and I find that model like really, like I thought it was beautiful, like really extraordinary, because it was centering trans people in a trans story, but also it's a really conscientious way of, you know, building that filmmaking community within that community. And that's something that I always would ask when I would be reviewing applications, particularly if I saw if there was like one crew member who was of a particular community. I would read it very carefully and try to determine if that person had any real power. Because a lot of times that was not the case. Sometimes they would just throw a BIPoC person on there so they could like access that particular funding. And it was clear either the person did not have any filmmaking experience. And if they didn't have any filmmaking experience, they were not introducing that person to like filmmaking programs where they could get that experience. And so they could build that repertoire. And it was really also important. This kind of goes back to what a point that Jason was making about now that there are things like the protocols for imaginative, and there's a lot of anti-racism language that's being used, while yet the proposals are still very much extractive and racist. So it's like as a reviewer, being on the viewer side, like bringing that critical eye to that, just to me to just like nip it in the bud.
There is this quote by Audre Lorde that says, "The master's tool won't dismantle the master's house," which I think is pretty great. So maybe Jason, you can allude, what tools do you think so we can dismantle the existing system and we can make it better?
Well, in Canada, in relation to the Indigenous filmmakers, the Indigenous Screen Office is our current our current toolbox. As I mentioned, it just recently got its allocation of funding in the last couple of weeks, and the organization will be spending most of the summer developing the programs and the support specific to Indigenous filmmakers. And again, these will be developed by Indigenous Canadians. And of course, the intent is not to replicate or mimic any of the existing systems there, but to really try to be responsive and also importantly, nimble to what Indigenous filmmakers need and want. Because again, too, I mean, opportunities often given to Indigenous filmmakers historically have sort of fit a certain kind of box. I mean, we talked about sort of, trauma porn, poverty porn, traumatainment. We've seen a lot of these films, and there's so many more stories out there that need to be heard, and so many that Indigenous filmmakers want to tell. So like our hope is that, with this new structure in place, it's not going to be the only access point for Indigenous filmmakers in Canada. And very clearly, all other state funders too are keeping their Indigenous specific funding, which was really an essential part of the advocacy that the ISO did as part of its work to get its funding in particular. So, I mean, we hope we'll see this change growing. I mean, certainly there has been change happening, but we still come up with everything that Toni just described. My time during Imaginative, it was weekly. I mean, sometimes daily, where we'd be contacted by non-Indigenous filmmakers who wanted a stamp of approval on a film that was often already complete. I hope we're seeing less of that, but we're still certainly seeing Indigenous attachments to projects, usually as consultants, which is a term that we hate and has to go. If they're doing the work, give them the proper credit and pay them accordingly to industry standards. I mean, that's essential. But I mean, we see so many works still that have an Indigenous theme, but the control is still very much in Indigenous hands on the artistic side. But as Tamara mentioned earlier, the next frontier is to really empower Indigenous production companies to own the productions that are being done, and also to importantly to support them to option story rights and other rights to tell these stories, because that's where we're constantly outbid, and where funders often always will go to established production companies. And so, it's still an uphill battle, and hopefully, with the ISO, the tools that they're developing will help to dismantle that and replace that.
how we both said that unfortunately in Germany, the discussions are pretty more basic. What do you think specifically in the German industry needs to change first of all, and right now is the biggest issue kind of?
Well, first of all, I think it's just a lack of pretty much acknowledgement and awareness. I mean, everything that Jason, Toni, and Tamara said, these are the things that we can really learn from, learning also from the experience and the knowledge that is already there inside of Germany. So the question is, how are these institutions, how are filmmakers, how are commissioners? We know that in Germany, commissioners have a lot of power with the television channels, because all of the citizens in Germany, they pay a monthly fee to the government, which then funds all the programs, and most of them, not the private ones. So the lack of awareness is very crucial. So the question of creating a sensibility, creating workshops for all the people in power positions, first of all, but also just to starting from film schools and television channels, but also in all the funding programs. This is very, very crucial, because when we talk about structures, I think the keywords are power sharing, empowering, and who actually benefits from it in the long run, right? And yeah, I would say I'm gonna write down everything and translate it into German, because I'm learning a lot from your experiences on how to work, for example, with data, but also actually the experience of how do you actually do advocacy, right?
Jason, go.
I mean, one of the things that Jesse Wente, who's the head of the Indigenous Screen Office, said a few years ago that I always loved is that, he said, we want the right to make bad films as well. I mean, not everything done through this current structure is like this cinematic gem, right? And so like, how can it be that sort of all these films get made, many of them not very good, some of them downright bad, right? And so we come from like a history here where these funders will support one Indigenous project per year and sort of, tick a box. And the other aspect too is that when a non-Indigenous filmmaker tells a story with Indigenous content, specifically in an industry like Canada, that story's been told. I mean, the industry is such that there's always reticence to kind of retell that same story or that same theme. We don't remake films like Hollywood does. So, I mean, it's very much taking up space in a very real way. So I've always loved that. Like, we want the right to make bad films too. It's a little flippant, of course, and it's intended to be, but it really draws attention to just the need to, if you're going to support films, diverse films in places like Germany, it can't just be one per year. It has to be absolutely meaningful change.
I would say Chris Rock has a joke, which I'm not going to tell, right? But particularly in the context of African Americans, like how African Americans would have reached true equality when we are free to be mediocre. So.
There is a question from the attendees. It's, when you give feedback to films in terms of discrimination and racism, how would you proceed? Have you got a list of criteria, or is the feedback individual depending on the person in charge? Maybe Tamara, do you want to answer it?
Sure. I mean, I've given feedback maybe because I'm just very blunt. It's direct, it's personal to the film. I'm the person who, when I'm at the Hot Docs Forum or the IDFA Forum, I've gone up to filmmakers and said, these are my issues with your film. Often they're films about Ethiopia. Generally, they end up being financed anyways, and those filmmakers just don't get it in terms of the feedback I gave them. But it's also that, the industry still supports and embraces those films, so those filmmakers have a career. Meanwhile, other voices are shut out from making films. It's very, very hard for African filmmakers to make a film and to own that film. And I think there's a lot of learning from the protocols work done within the Indigenous community that is quite transferable to Africa, because we don't have protocols that we can give to these European or white filmmakers to say, if you want to come in and make a film in Ghana, in Kenya, wherever it is, these are the things you should be thinking about. So in terms of this criteria, that type of framework could help us to have more of a list. And I think increasingly in Africa, we see European institutions, a lot of them are actually German, coming in fund the African industry. It's the new cool thing right now to have African films, but the decision-making on the programming and the resources and the training needed for African filmmakers is sitting in these European institutions. So we also need protocols about the transfer of those financial resources and the decision-making about the programs to serve the communities to sit within the African organization. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and I think a lot of sharing between other communities to help inform that work.
Mm-hmm. Toni, can you tell us a little bit about the Programmers of Color Collective? Because I think the work being in a collective and empowering each other is really important, and then answering in addition the question, what do you think about quotas? So percentages, at least this percentage of BIPoC filmmakers, for example. What do you think about that having in the industry?
Well, okay, on the quota piece, I'm going to say the quote, "Not all my skin folk are my kinfolk." So, and what that means is, like, just because somebody is of my particular race or color doesn't mean that we are aligned in our support of our race. There's been so many instances where people put up a BIPoC person as like, oh, they're this figurehead essentially, and they're a token, but they're very much in line with like white supremacist work practices and ways of being and thought. So that's my thought on quotas. The Programmers of Color Collective was founded a few years ago by Lucy Mukherjee and Timba, who looks for Berlinel, Timba Beba. And it was founded as a means for programmers of color from all around the world to organize around the work they do. One of the initiatives is to, number one, get more programmers of color, but also to bring a more critical eye to the curating process, because what was happening in the industry, and unfortunately is still happening, is films that are programmed are often from one particular filmmaker, from one particular point of view, that don't really represent the values and the communities of color that are out there. So the Programmers of Color initiative is to alleviate that, but also just to have a support system for these programs of color who are often maybe the only ones in their organizations to support and rally around each other. And there was a talk that Lucy Mukherjee moderated this summer, completely blanking on what the forum was, but she was talking about this initiative in Canada that got a lot of fanfare because they were actually selecting programmers of color. But then when you read the fine print, they were expected to do all this work and they weren't getting paid. You know, and I like that is egregious. And a lot of time, our labor isn't valued. Like our labor, well, I'll say our contributions are valued, but then that labor is not compensated because there's just this expectation we're just supposed to give it for free. And I think that's a part of the commodification and the capitalization of the work that we do, and also who we are. I mean, I kind of go way back to it, you know, because my background, I am a descendant of enslaved people here in the United States. My people have been here since the 1700s. And in many of the ways that our labor was used to build wealth, I can compare it to the way that our stories are used to build wealth for white filmmakers when they come in. So like, how do we need those tools to stop that type of thing. And I do want to do a shout out to the Jerome Foundation. They are a foundation here in the US that funds arts organizations. And I was on a review committee for them a few years ago. And as part of the process, one thing they asked us to do when we were meeting to decide the final projects that were going to be, that were going to go to their board to be to be given funds, was they asked us in the room, okay, what are your own biases? And they gave us prompts to figure that out. And that was the first time I've been on any review committee where that had been asked. And the great thing about that was, because we were open about the biases that we had, whether they were positive or negative, we could bring that to the conversation of deciding who we wanted to fund. And it was such an inspiring experience. And it was such a learning experience as well, because like we were asked to look at ourselves as we were, and look at each other as we were examining who to allocate funds to. And like, to me, it was just a phenomenal model that I wish other organizations would adopt.
Thank you. There's a question for Jason. Is there an exchange internationally about papers and protocols? And then the second part is, if you said your organization gets asked frequently to consult with other people. Is that true, or to give feedback? But you said you don't like that kind of feedback. If you could explore that more.
Sure. I mean, I don't know of any sort of formal international exchange about protocols or not. I mean, one of the things that we discovered with when we released the protocols and pathways is that after several months, the organization, we were contacted by a lot of different sectors. So non-film sectors. We were contacted by those in the medical profession, those in other types of non-related film sectors who were looking to develop similar types of protocols. Because I do think, I mean, there's some, if you read it, I mean, there's some really fundamental protocols about respect, about trust building, about reciprocity, which is really fundamental in terms of sort of responsible filmmaking. And one hopes, certain questions for filmmakers and decision makers to ask themselves. I mean, really, and so much of this comes down to that. It comes down to like a really fundamental difference in a worldview of filmmaking. I mean, there's a prevalent idea that the individual artistic rights trumps everything, but that's simply not the case. Certainly, from an Indigenous perspective. I mean, Indigenous artists are creating films within a larger context of a responsibility to community and to nation within these protocols. We often say too that protocols, oftentimes I think people can see them as quite esoteric or abstract, and actually they're really not. Filmmakers create films in a co-production model with different regions and territories all the time, and that's very much the case with these. I mean, this is really what the proposition is for filmmakers when it comes to Indigenous protocols. At the organization, yes, we were contacted so often by filmmakers, but that wasn't our role. Our mandate as an organization was to support Indigenous filmmakers and to present their work. So we would not give that feedback. That's not our role. And again, I think, oftentimes, especially in the early days and still now, absolutely, there's resistance to non-Indigenous filmmakers often hearing that you may just not be able to tell that story, that you might just have to accept no. A lot of the questions we hear is, oh, I'm doing this Indigenous story, but I'm having issues getting permission or having access from the community. And that's a clear message. You're either not doing it right or you shouldn't be doing it at all. And that is something I think that hopefully changes. And it absolutely should change, because sometimes it's just not your story to tell. A lot of the times, actually, I'll say that.
How, there's a question maybe you can answer. It is, as a person of color, you're confronted with the wide expectation of exposing your ethnic group as a victim or any other role that has been assigned to your ethnic group in relation to white supremacy. When approaching topics of your ethnic community, how do you separate from these dominant exploitative narratives and set out to explore your own perspective when you have always taught differently?
Can you hear me? Say again? Okay. So, well, first of all, I would say it's a process, and it's a process of unlearning, and actually knowing that, especially in Germany, we live in a white-dominated culture that, as I said, is in a big lack of acknowledging racism and structural discrimination within a society. So it is, I think the first step is acknowledging and seeing that that we're all in a learning curve. And when you're coming from a marginalized group and as a filmmaker, I would definitely suggest stick around people that make you feel comfortable, the community, try to build a community, unlearn together with your community, and question all of the systems that you seem that are yours, which are actually not, right? And try to find your own voice with the people in the community that actually empower you, and make a very clear cut, realizing that these people have no interest in my growth. And I think that this is a very important point when, not only when it comes to filmmaking, I think it's a good idea for life in general. Yeah.
Tamara, maybe you can jump on the next question. It is, do you have any advice or thoughts for anthropologists working with film, shooting footage within communities or places where they do field work? How to manage the fine line between self-reflexivity, such as through including the anthropologist in the film and taking up space that could be given to other people?
I don't know that I can answer that. I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities with some of the stuff we've already talked about. But it's also, I think, you know, there's research standards and protocols. I think that hopefully as an anthropologist, you'd already be following or keeping in mind, you know, things to do with duty of care to the community you're engaging with and how you're engaging with them. So I think it also depends on what the output is. Is this something that's for a report? Is this why are you filming people, and why is that the necessary vehicle to do your work? I think would be part of my process, and to understand then what is the output of that work afterwards. And I think, you know, there's different ways that different professionals engage with filmmaking in terms of how we get access, how we get permissions. I mean, journalists come into communities and film, and they don't ask for release forms. They don't get location release forms. So there's things we do in documentary filmmaking. So it can be a huge shock for a journalist to now be making a film and realize, oh, every person who speaks needs to have a release. So I think there's some things that are transportable between industries, but some things that won't be. And I don't know enough about anthropological work to fully, I think, comment on that question.
Maybe, Toni, you want to add something to the question as a visual anthropologist?
Yes, I would. Like I graduated with my bachelor's in anthropology in 1993, and then my degree in visual anthropology in 2016. So there was a gap there, but what I began to see in the difference in the programs, you know, other than it being a bachelor's and a master's programs, is like in what's happening now in the field of anthropology is there is a growing sense of moving, like definitely moving away from extractive storytelling. There is a lot more writings from anthropologists who are part of communities, who are studying their own communities, and there's more of a drive and support toward that. But also as part of learning the ethnographic process, we are taught to look at ourselves and really look at our own assumptions that we're bringing into a community. And there are exercises that one engages in to do that. So like, I'll give an example for my thesis film. I did it on Black vegans in Los Angeles. And I came in, some of the assumptions I came in with and that I were asked to interrogate before I even began filming was I was assuming that most of the Black vegans in my film were coming from, you know, a traditional, you know, like Southern, you know, traditional Southern African-American diet like I had. And that wasn't the case, you know, so as I began to meet people, like that assumption was interrogated. But I also began to interrogate some of my own assumptions, because even though my experiences around veganism had been like multicultural and diverse, when I thought about vegan, I became very aware that I thought I was like visualizing like a skinny white girl. even though that wasn't non-reality. So I was having to challenge these assumptions that the media that kind of inundated me with. And we are taught to do these things before we even begin to like pick up the camera. So I would highly recommend any filmmaker, even though they're not an anthropologist, like pick up a book on ethnography. And it can really help you to like ask those questions of yourself so you can begin to ask the appropriate questions when you're out there in the field.
One last question before we round up is, I've been pushing back against the hashtag Black Girl Magic, because this notion of magical resilience fails to critique the structures that make resilience necessary in the first place. I'd love to hear what the panelists feel about this and how their understandings of resilience impact their storytelling. Anyone who wants to start can start. Maybe Jason or Toni, yeah?
Yeah, well, I have an interesting relationship with resilience as one who has been, I'm in therapy. I recommend it for everybody. Therapy for a number of years now. And my view of resilience has really shifted because I come from a stance where, when I think about some of the experiences I've had in the past that like caused me to need therapy, it would have been nice to not have gone through those things. And it would have been nice to not have to have been resilient, because resilience definitely is a human quality, and it's how we like bounce back from things. However, it is, for me, it is like a way of, it can be a coping mechanism in a way. And sometimes I wish there were the structures that are in place that cause trauma didn't exist. So we could just be, because it takes a lot of energy to process trauma, and it takes whatever that trauma, whether it's in the documentary space or not. And it takes a lot of energy to be resilient. Yeah, I have mixed feelings about the whole resilience. Yeah, but the fact that you bring up the Black Girl Magic, I'm like, oh, that is interesting. I need to rethink that, because I'm thinking, oh yeah, magical Negro and all kinds of tropes. So I don't know if that answers that.
Thank you for your answer, Toni. If any of you, Tamara, how Jason, have some final remarks for our viewers, I would leave you the last words of this panel.
I just wanted to comment on one of the questions in the chat that I saw a few times was about like the role of training for white members of the screen sector, be they the director, producers, or members of institutions. And I think often that there's this sudden rush to have this anti-oppression, anti-racism, all of these trainings, and think that, okay, yes, I've done that, now I'm good. There's a lot of, requests that I think people put out when they're making a film, that let me add a person from that community in some sort of tokenizing role so that I can say again, yes, check, now it's okay for me to be doing this. That as an organization, if I work with an Indigenous, Black, or racialized organization, they can somehow give me a rubber stamp and qualify that we're above board on these issues. And I think that we have to be really mindful that, this is not a short, quick fix solution like that. I know as the REMC, we're not interested in rubber stamping anyone to say that the things you're doing are okay. We're more interested in working through consultation with community to help find solutions and to enforce policy change. So I think I would just caution people when they're thinking about, why are you doing those things and what is the output you're going to get, and do them, but realize it's not this quick fix.
I love everything that's been put forward here, and it's all really relevant to my experience and what I hear from filmmakers as well too. I guess there's two things that are just coming to mind. One of them is, when I talk about our on-screen protocols and pathways and about responsible filmmaking, whether it might not be your story to tell. I always think it's important to point out too that, that applies to the diversity of Indigenous filmmakers as well too. I'm Anishinaabe. That doesn't give me an innate right to tell an Inuit or Mohawk story. These aren't my communities. These aren't my nations. So there's that there too. And the other part of it is about, I mean, I think, you know, I just wish I could sort of, you know, if I'm leaving with something, it's just understand that there is a different approach to filmmaking. You know, with every single documentary filmmaker, Indigenous documentary filmmaker I know, and certainly, you know, with the works that I'm a producer on currently, I mean, that responsibility to the community and nation is really always at the forefront. And it doesn't just apply to pre-production or the production of the film. It's about sort of that longevity, right? It's sort of that care. We as Indigenous filmmakers can't just leave our community once the film is wrapped, right? There's like,
Jason?
Can easily just walk away.
Oh yeah, no.
Oh, did I freeze?
Yeah, you freeze that you as community, as an Indigenous community, you can't leave.
No, you can't leave, right? But, and those not from that community can walk away without having that kind of responsibility to that community or nation going forward. That's a really significant difference when it comes to filmmaking and storytelling on screen. You know, we have to carry that. We have that relationship to carry going forward.
Okay, thank you. How one last, some last.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts on the question of resilience. And as Toni, I think she said all the important things. And I just wanted to add that when it comes to resilience, there are these structures we can't really leave because it is there. And when we face these structures, I think it's just important to choose your battles, and because it is a lot of emotional work that we have to put in, and we can't really choose because we have to somehow position ourselves to all these things happening to us. But at the same time, once you have a community, I think at the same time it's really also important to celebrate, to really empower each other, and to do it as equally as you're doing the emotional extra work, to celebrate yourself extra, double, triple, right? Because this is just to find a balance, and this is your right to find a balance, to celebrate, and because it's a process of healing, and in the process of healing, we should all be glorious and celebrating. Yeah. Now Sagan is gone again.
But that's such a beautiful thing, how, I mean, that's absolutely it. You know, when Indigenous people tell those difficult stories on screen, there's a really strong element of not just, you know, maybe healing for the filmmaker, but also very much community or national healing that goes on in telling that story and bringing that to screen and presenting it. It is really such an essential part of it.
Yeah, there's something with the beautiful things about the documentary space when it works right is when truths are told, that opens up a space for healing of wounds. Even when those are hard truths. I don't know if you've all had a chance to watch Ryle Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes, but it's utterly brilliant. And just hearing the reality of the impact of colonialism just told just without being sugarcoated or minimized was just so incredibly empowering. So there's healing in hearing the truth of one's existence and one's lived experience.
Thank you all so much for all your thoughts, and thank you for bearing with me with the technical difficulties. I really appreciated all your insights, all your thoughts and everything. And I think this was a really fruitful discussion. To everyone still listening, you can check out Tamara, Toni, Hao, and Jason on our website. You can check out all their work and the collectives they're working in. You can find links there, and I really urge you to look there and find out what all these great institutions are doing, what kind of work they're doing, and what you can benefit from there as well. And everyone else, thank you for watching. If you have more specific questions that we couldn't answer now, you can join our workshop tomorrow at 5 p.m. with Toni Bell, where you can ask really specific questions about your projects that you have and how to approach it. Otherwise, I think we are done for today. And yeah, I would love to see you again next year, maybe in real life, maybe at this festival, and continue this conversation. And I think that's the most important, that we don't stop here, but keep on working to fulfill all these things that we talked about today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.